All right. So what I'm what I want to talk about today is a paper we recently published. If you want to read the details of the paper, it's available in uh, Social Media and Society. It's the July 20th article, and the paper is a series of is some survey work that we did to look at how people were dealing with misinformation on social media. And I'm going to highlight kind of the results of the survey findings that we had, and I'm kind of try to tie it in a little bit to HCI, and I think where HCI could maybe go in terms of some of its research based on these findings. So the work itself is focused on fake news, and I think at this point we're all pretty familiar with what we mean by fake news. But of course, even defining fake news itself is a pretty big challenge. It can mean a lot of different things. Fake news, if we take the popular media description, it's often fake news seems to be defined as things that our elected officials don't like that the media reports. Fake news could be defined as the unintentional publication of misinformation. And if we look at fake news that way, then that can implicate actual journalists who make mistakes when they publish. And then fake news can have other meanings as well. The meaning that we have taken is, I'll back up there. The meaning we've taken is fake news is something that has an intent to mislead. Um, what we wanted to look at here was an effect that we've seen in other literature called the third person effect. And the third person effect in prior literature has suggested that when we have media exposure that people see as problematic or harmful, people tend to overestimate the effects of that media exposure on other people, and they have a tendency to underestimate the effects of that media exposure on themselves. Some of this literature and some of these theories, they had their origins in research in the 80s on pornography, where people felt that pornography was bad in the sense that it affected other people. But then if you ask people like, well, how does it affect you? People, oh, it doesn't have that much of an effect on me. So this phenomenon that we see happen leads people to often adopt certain attitudes and behaviors about how we should regulate media. Particularly in the 80s, we saw a strong support for heavy government regulation of pornography because people felt it was harmful to other people. And that's one of the key metrics that you tend to see is that there's an interest in more censorship of media that people perceive as undesirable in terms of how it affects other individuals. Um, when we look at the topic specifically of fake news, we see that we see it obviously it's was fairly prevalent in our recent social media experiences, and some of the research around fake news has found that people are a lot more susceptible to it than they think. Then when we look at how people have been impacted by headlines, people often fall for fake news headlines and don't realize that the information in the headlines isn't true. Um, but then that raises this question that sort of led to our research. If people aren't aware of the fact that they're being influenced or by fake news that they may see in their news feeds, to what degree are they concerned about fake news? And that was the beginning of this research. Um, we had a couple ideas about what we thought people were doing with fake news or how they were responding to it. We thought that um, people would probably ascribe to that third person effect when it came to fake news, that they would say, well, I'm not really affected by it, but other people in on social media are. And we figured that if people thought other people were affected by fake news, then they would probably say, okay, this is bad for society. And then we wondered, how would that result in some of their attitudes? Would they see a need for more public censorship of news and information on social media? Would they like to see more government, intervention on social media, more regulation to get rid of the fake news? Or would they have a different attitude? Based on prior research, censorship tends to be where people tend to go when they think about things that are bad and how they're affecting the public. But we also wondered, how might this affect how people are sharing just news overall on social media? Because it could be that if you're concerned about this, that you might be also unsure about what is true and what isn't true, and that might also influence your overall news sharing attitudes. So as I said, there is this challenge of defining fake news. And when we set about to define it for the people in our survey, we gave them a very specific definition of it to try to help capture the kinds of things that we were looking at. And we defined fake news as the intentional and intentionally and verifiably false information. So we're separating this from other types of what you could say are fake news, where, for example, a media outlet maybe unintentionally publishes facts that turn out to be false. And so we're focused specifically on that information that's out there that's trying to manipulate public opinion for some reason. So we conducted a survey to get to these questions. We did this through Amazon Mechanical Turk. We paid our participants a little bit more than what you normally would pay in Mechanical Turk so we could get a better sample. We had a decent response rate and a pretty good amount of survey participants for a generalizable sample. They ranged in age from 20 to 65 years old. And we used Qualtrics software to capture the data. Here are the key metrics that I'm going to kind of talk about today. This is all, of course, self-reported data, so that's a limitation to our findings. But when we looked at how we measured third-person effect, we looked at the differences between how concerned people felt about fake news and its impact on them versus the measure, the score that they gave on how concerned they were about its impact on other people. We asked people if how much were they concerned about its overall influence on society. We asked them about their support for censorship of fake news, and then we asked them about how often they shared just overall news and information. So this is our basic model that we developed, and in this model, we looked at direct and indirect effects that individuals had on their overall news sharing intent. To kind of summarize some of the highlights here, and there are a few actually findings that I'm still kind of wrestling with. But one of the things that I think is worth pointing out is that beta weight there that's negative 0.22 between third person effect and news sharing. We ultimately find that people who are concerned that fake news is having an effect on other people are also less likely to share news overall. One of the puzzling findings that we discovered was that even though people were concerned for the effect that fake news has on other individuals, they actually had that diminished their support for censorship, which was different from some of the other prior research. To kind of summarize some of these findings, we found a basic support for third person effect. That's, typical, a very typical finding in terms of we found people overestimate the effect of fake news on other people and underestimate its effect on themselves. But we did find this interesting finding that people said, look, we don't necessarily think the solution to fixing fake news is for the government to censor social media. And we've kind of wrestled with what that means. It may mean that the public is not sure they trust the government to censor, to make laws that would censor social media. It may be that they want to see other forms of censorship. And in the news these last few weeks, we've seen social media companies themselves come in and take action to suppress certain kinds of speech. And it may be that the public would rather allow social media companies to make those decisions than allow the government. I think that's still something up for discussion here. The research doesn't provide any definitive answers there. But one of the other key takeaways, and I think is kind of interesting, is that as people grow increasingly concerned about the prevalence of misinformation on social media, they're also less likely to engage in overall sharing of any form of news. And so when we think about this and we think about the role that news plays in informing publics, the unintended consequence of misinformation is possibly that it actually limits the public's access to also good information. And so I think we have, to think about this unintended consequence effect possibly of how fake news itself impacts legitimate information on social media. And one of the things we know is that sharing news and reading news is a key factor in leading to political discussions. It's what fosters that sort of back and forth debate that we have in our democracy. And so there may be some other concerns there. I think there's a couple things that we can think about as, this was pretty straight social science kind of research, but I think there's some implications for HCI. There's possibly some design implications, for future work here. One of the questions that I'm still trying to sort out is why do respondents seem to have concerns about censorship, as I mentioned, and I'm wondering in the current historical context if they would have the same concerns for other forms of suppressing speech that aren't all out just sort of blanket bans on speech. Maybe, for example, deplatforming approaches that would maybe use shadow banning techniques, where we don't necessarily censor the speech, but we don't highlight it in our social feeds with the algorithms that rank, those things that trend and things like that. The public probably doesn't have a clear understanding of how some of those things work, but we may see sort of differences in our results if we explain to people how all of that worked. And they may say, well, I don't want people to be directly censored, but I do think maybe we should suppress some of the radical outrage that's on the internet. That's one of the ideas that I'm kind of mulling around. I'm also thinking about whether social media, taking it on itself to engage in deplatforming is something that the public would find acceptable, more so than if they saw government making those decisions. And I think, this raises questions for us as designers about how we envision privileging certain kinds of content on social media over others. And, it opens up questions, I think, for us about how we may, in the future, want to design, our social feeds for what we rank and don't rank in terms of what's important information. So I did do this work with colleague, Fan Yang, who's a professor at University of Albany. She's doing some really good work on sort of the psychological impact of fake news on individuals. So if you want to reach out to her, feel free to do so.